Prince William and Catherine did something they almost never do. They ran. Not in a press release way, not in a deeply concerned statement. They physically left their home in the dark with 3 sleeping children because of something that had been sitting directly underneath their youngest son's bedroom for 2 years, and nobody knew it was there. Not the security teams who sweep that property constantly. Not the engineers who signed off on the building. Not the people whose entire job is knowing every inch of the Windsor estate. 2 years. That's the number that refuses to sit quietly. And once you understand what was actually under that floor, this stops being a story about security and becomes a story about how you ever convince your children they're safe again. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to start with the house itself. Adelaide Cottage wasn't just somewhere small and cozy that looked good in lifestyle pieces. It was an answer to a question William and Catherine had been asking since before George was born. In 2022, when they announced they were moving to Adelaide Cottage, the coverage was predictable. Smaller house, less staff, more grass. A future king and queen consort apparently stepping away from palace formality, choosing a modest, ivy-covered cottage to give their kids something closer to normal. It sounded like a brand move, a tone shift, simple, easy narrative. But that framing missed what was really going on. This wasn't aesthetic, it was architecture as strategy. They had turned down bigger, more prestigious houses on the Windsor estate for this one, on purpose. Adelaide Cottage had gardens instead of galleries. It had a kitchen where Catherine actually cooked, really cooked, weeknight dinners, birthday cakes, those messy flower-on-your-sleeves evenings that don't happen in a house run by 40 staff. It had bedrooms where 3 children could grow up with doors that closed, arguments that didn't echo through ballrooms, and the sense that their lives still had edges and privacy. They gave up space, status, and convenience to live there. They chose it anyway. Because for 2 parents trying to raise royal children without raising them only royal, this cottage was the closest thing they could find to an answer. What was taken from them later wasn't just a structure, it was that answer. Before we get into the night itself, if you want this kind of deep, careful breakdown instead of the 2-paragraph version the headlines give you, make sure you're subscribed, because this story isn't finished, and when the next part breaks, you'll want the full context. Now, let's go under the floor. It starts mundanely. A scheduled structural inspection, no drama. Engineers with clipboards, scanners, and radar came into Adelaide Cottage to look at the foundations. This is the kind of thing that happens routinely across the estate, especially on older properties. Nobody involved thought they were about to change a family's life. 17 minutes into that survey, everything changed. Underneath Adelaide Cottage runs a network of buried passages older than the cottage itself. Some sections date back to the 1640s, to the English Civil War. On one level, that's just interesting history. On another, it's terrifying, because every modern survey missed them. Every security sweep missed them. Every official plan of that property going back decades said nothing. No suspected void, no unmapped corridor, nothing. Centuries of stone shafts and chambers beneath one of the most monitored estates in Britain, and nobody on the payroll knew they existed. If those tunnels had been empty, this would have been embarrassing and expensive, but manageable. Seal the entrances, install sensors, redraw the maps, add another chapter to some future documentary about hidden Windsor. Old stone doesn't stalk anybody. The tunnels themselves weren't the threat. What they found inside them was. The first sign that this wasn't just forgotten stone came at around 11:45 p.m. Infrared sensors embedded in the cottage's walls picked up movement in a space that, on paper, didn't exist. Protection officers moved quietly into position. Air changed. Pressure shifted. In houses like this, even the invisible feels different when something is wrong. William surfaced from sleep first. Military training rewires the way you rest. You stop ignoring subtle changes. Catherine woke seconds later, pulled up by the same sense that something in the night was wrong before anyone said a word. They didn't start firing questions. When you spend your life in a system where every reaction is watched, you learn the hard way that in the first 60 seconds of a crisis, you get more from listening than jumping in. Then came the knock. Soft, repeated, not frantic but not casual. William crossed the room and opened the door to find Marcus Headley, head of their personal protection unit, standing there. 3 officers lined the corridor behind him, each positioned for a problem none of them wanted to explain in full on that landing. Headley's expression told most of the story before he spoke. No one in that hallway was about to say, "It's probably nothing." He explained that the structural team had discovered evidence of recent human activity in the spaces under the house. Not historic traces, not ancient tools. Recent, repeated, tools with clean edges, footprints in unsettled dust, empty water bottles stamped with last month's date, a folding chair, placed, a thermal blanket, and photographs, fresh photographs of the Wales family living their private lives, school runs, garden games. Catherine walking her usual route across the estate, all taken from angles that proved the photographer knew their patterns, their quiet hours, the exact moment the security rotation dips. Someone had been under that house, more than once, for long enough to build a system. Headley put it into 5 words that pulled the floor out from under the room. They were under the house, Not outside the fence, not at the gate, not in the hedge with a long lens. Under the floor of the bedrooms their children sleep in. There is no category in your mind for that sentence. You can slot intruder at the gate into a known box. You can handle someone over the wall. Under the house. Doesn't have a box. It just has the corridor down which your children are sleeping and the choice you make when you hear it. Catherine didn't wait for more detail. As soon as Headley's explanation crossed the line from structure to children, she was already moving down the hall. Years of training in public composure collapsed into one instinct: get the children out. The evacuation had to be three things at once: fast, quiet, and gentle. George, Charlotte, and Louis needed to be woken, reassured, dressed, and moved without panic, while nobody yet knew which precise chambers had been used, or by whom, or how recently. Underneath the public image of calm, Catherine has always had one fixed rule: every decision goes through a child-first filter. That rule was suddenly the only thing that mattered. William watched as she went from room to room. Her voice stayed soft as she framed the situation as an adventure for three sleepy faces who didn't yet understand what had changed. George, 11, already old enough to know that randomness doesn't apply to his life the way it does to other children. Charlotte, 9, quieter but perceptive. Louis, 6, on the edge of dreams, clinging to familiarity. In the middle of that, Charlotte asked the question that cut straight through the story her mother was trying to build. "Are we safe here, Mummy?" Catherine paused. Less than a second. But long enough for William to see the cost. That pause is where you choose between comfort and honesty, knowing neither of them is free. The mechanics of the evacuation were smooth in the way you hope you never have to prove they can be. Vehicles waited on the drive with engines already running. Routes had been pre-agreed, rehearsed in exercises everyone hoped would forever be theoretical. Emergency bags, packed and updated 4 times a year, kept in a place where nobody has to search for them at midnight, were already being carried out. That detail matters. Those bags are part of the normal, invisible infrastructure of their life. On ordinary afternoons, they sit unseen in cupboards while school uniforms get ironed and pasta boils on the stove. They represent the knowledge that any night can be the one when you leave. William carried Louis down the stairs. The boy's head was on his shoulder, still half asleep. Catherine followed, one hand guiding George, the other resting on Charlotte. On the gravel outside, in the cold November air, Catherine stood barefoot in whatever she'd been sleeping in, coat pulled tight, one of her son's shoes in her hand. It had come off on the stairs, smiling at 3 frightened children so they wouldn't see the fear in the faces of the armed men quietly surrounding them. That is the image that stays, the Princess of Wales, on her own driveway, being relocated from the home she chose. Before she got into the car, she turned back for one last look at Adelaide Cottage. The house glowed in the dark, warm light in its windows, everything physically unchanged. The building hadn't betrayed them, the ground had. William's hand found hers. They left. By morning, white forensic tents stood on the lawns of Adelaide Cottage, each planted over an entrance into the tunnel system below. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Wright had come in during the night, chosen because she knew both how to deal with historic properties and how to navigate the legal constraints that surround anything involving the Wales family. Her team rolled out ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging units. Ground-penetrating radar lets you read the geography beneath the surface without tearing up the lawn. It is how you reveal, in one long night, what centuries of plans had failed to show. The results were worse than anyone expected. The tunneled voids didn't sit neatly beneath Adelaide Cottage and stop. They extended, they connected, they ran toward the castle itself. They reached 4 other properties on the estate: Frogmore Cottage, Royal Lodge, and 2 more whose names mattered less than the pattern. Together, they formed a hidden network under some of the most sensitive ground in the country. For years, possibly longer, there had been a way to move around the Windsor estate that dodged every gate, every guardhouse, every camera, and every controlled entrance. And the system built to stop exactly that kind of thing had no idea it existed. If those spaces had been empty, the response could have been purely technical. Seal them, wire them, add them to security diagrams, make sure nobody ever uses them again. That isn't what the evidence showed. In one chamber directly beneath the bedroom where Prince Louis sleeps, they found a camp. This wasn't archaeology. It was someone's base, a chair, a blanket, enough water to stay for entire days at a time. And more photographs, not random shots collected on impulse. A careful set of images that proved the person who took them understood not only the family's public movements, but their routine private patterns. When the school run starts, when Catherine walks a particular path, when the protective bubble briefly thins by necessity. That level of detail doesn't belong to a trespasser who had a rush of adrenaline and snuck in once. It belongs to someone who has built a long-term operation. Then came the number: 2 years. The oldest items recovered, ruined batteries, worn blankets, old food packaging, early notebooks, pointed back close to 2 years. 2 winters and 2 summers, 2 cycles of birthdays and holidays, 2 school years of pickups and drop-offs, 2 years of normal, everyday life being lived above, and someone keeping their own calendar beneath. The notebooks were damp and difficult, but after conservation and magnification came transcription. As technicians pulled the words out of the blurred ink, a pattern emerged. At first, the pages were about stone, angles, passages, the architecture itself. Then slowly the focus shifted upward. Times, temperatures, lights on, lights off, voices faintly heard, children's footsteps. Catherine's kitchen rhythms, William's departures and arrivals. Eventually, the entries morphed into something else entirely, a man narrating the lives of people who did not know he existed as if they were characters in his story. That story had a name behind it, Malcolm Hendrickx. 47. Former curator at a small historical society in Kent. According to the records, he had spent years immersed in old plans and forgotten layouts before his behavior deteriorated. His colleagues raised concerns, and he lost the job that had defined him. What happens when a person whose identity is built around the interpretation of old maps loses the room where those maps are kept? In Hendrickx's case, it looks like this. He took his expertise home, turned it inward, and chose new maps, the ones under royal houses. He had the skills. He could parse 17th century architectural drawings that most people would find unreadable. He knew how to request archival material without leaving tracks. He understood how gaps in the paperwork can signal places where something used to exist and fell off official lists. He convinced himself that there was treasure beneath Windsor. Financial treasure? Historical treasure. The word itself stopped being specific. The point for him was that it would be something big enough to prove he'd been right, and the people who let him go had been wrong. In the narrative he formed in his journals, the Wales family were not people. They were the barrier between him and that vindication. The psychological assessment Dr. Miranda Foster put together from his posts and his journals followed a pattern she has seen many times. Interest becomes expertise. Expertise hardens into obsession. Obsession turns into grievance. Somewhere along that curve, public figures, in this case William and Catherine and their children, stop being distant symbols and become the villains in a story the obsessed person is writing for himself. Catherine heard that assessment and understood exactly why she felt the way she did. She had made her peace with cameras at engagements, scrutiny of outfits, commentary on parenting. She had absorbed all of that as the cost of the life she and William had chosen. This wasn't that. This was someone hiding under the rooms where her children slept, cultivating a private relationship with their routine without their knowledge. For William, the problem was as much about what next as what has already happened. A man who has spent 2 years under your house does not become less invested when you destroy the world he built there. If anything, the shock of losing his tunnels risks tipping his obsession into a new phase. That is why this escalated from a property issue into a national manhunt. His car led investigators to a rented cottage a few miles from Windsor, the kind of place someone could live unnoticed for a long time. Inside, the space looked recently vacated, hurried but not chaotic. He had taken what mattered to him. Within hours of the tunnels being discovered, he somehow knew his project was over in that location, and left. Materials on the desk and pinned to the wall suggested his focus wasn't limited to Windsor. There were notes on Sandringham, Balmoral, other estates, other old plans. The narrative in his head had outgrown one cottage. Dr. Foster's updated assessment made something else clear. Significant humiliation, the loss of his underground base, the exposure of his notes, on top of long-standing obsession, increases the risk that someone like Hendrickx moves from watching and mapping into acting and confronting. This is the point in the story where the easy answers run out. Because it isn't just about catching a man. It's about deciding what you can do with the knowledge he leaves behind in the minds of the people he never met but profoundly affected. 3 weeks after the evacuation, William and Catherine confronted the question they'd both been quietly avoiding. Could they ever take their children back to Adelaide Cottage and tell them, with a straight face, this is home, in the way they meant it before? On the technical side, the answer was clean. Every tunnel entrance sealed and wired, new sensors buried, extra cameras installed. Layers of detection that made the cottage, in pure security terms, safer now than it had ever been. But houses aren't only physical spaces, they're mental ones. You can seal stone, you cannot unlearn what was under it. Every room was now marked by what they knew lived beneath it for 2 years, the kitchen where Catherine baked. The sitting room where they had movie nights. The bedrooms where 3 children laughed and sulked and slept. None of those spaces had changed. All of them had. For Catherine, Adelaide Cottage had been the embodiment of a question. Can you give royal children a home where royal feels like something that happens to them outside, not inside? After the tunnels, that question felt naive. She could know, rationally, that she hadn't missed anything, that it wasn't her fault. Emotional logic is different. It hears someone was under my children and takes on guilt anyway. William walked the house with a different kind of eyes. He checked the system, understood the upgrades, saw the new layer of safety. And he saw something else, that every measure they added to make the cottage secure pushed it closer to feeling like the high-security environments they had deliberately stepped away from when they chose it. The press statement that went out contained 11 carefully chosen words. The Prince and Princess of Wales are relocating to allow for comprehensive infrastructure and security work at Adelaide Cottage. It sounded temporary, technical, reversible. Everybody inside the situation knew that psychologically it probably wasn't. By evening, the story had gone global. Cameras outside a closed gate, commentators speculating, people leaving flowers because, when they hear family had to leave their home in the night, that's the one ritual. Lying underneath all of this is a name you don't need anyone to say to feel. Diana. She used to take her boys out in unmarked cars, away from palaces, down monotonous streets, to places where nobody recognized them for an hour. She spent her life chased by lenses. She died in front of them. Her son bought a small house with a garden so his own children would have somewhere the job didn't fully reach. And he ended up carrying his son downstairs in the dark, out into the cold, because someone with a camera had found them anyway. Not from outside the gate, but from underneath it. Malcolm Hendrickx never found treasure. There is no gold under Windsor, no hidden vault, no cinematic revelation. There is stone, water, old plans, and a man's obsession. He gave up his job, 2 years of his life, and whatever remained of his stability to chase a story that existed only in his head. The only thing he successfully removed from the Windsor estate was a family's belief that they were safe in their own beds. He is almost certainly still out there, somewhere, convinced that he is the one who has been wronged. Convinced that the family he crawled beneath were villains in a story about him. In reality, he is a man who took 3 children's home away from them and found nothing. This story does not end neatly. Hendrickx hasn't been found. Adelaide Cottage stands behind new layers of security that have turned it into exactly the kind of environment William and Catherine were trying not to raise their children in. 3 children now live with the knowledge that the ordinary childhood their parents worked so hard to create had a secret level they never knew existed until it was too late. Charlotte checks the doors. Louis asks when they're going back to their real house. George watches the adults in the headlines and learns, far earlier than anyone wanted, how to read tension in a room. On Christmas Eve, William and Catherine stood together by a window, the children finally asleep, talking quietly about spring, about where they would live, what they could build next, how much of that original answer they could salvage somewhere else. Neither said out loud what they both knew, that Adelaide Cottage is probably finished for them. Not because it is physically unsafe, because knowing cannot be undone. If you've stayed with this to the end, you already understand that this isn't really a story about tunnels or sensors or locks. It's a story about the one thing no security upgrade can reach, the moment when a child learns something terrifying is possible, and the question every parent has to live with afterwards. How do you put something back in the box once your children know it's there? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want to be here when the next chapter breaks, because Hendrickx is still out there, and this story is not finished, make sure you're subscribed.